In the mid-90s, two like-minded individuals with a deep appreciation for gore and horror films started work on a hack-and-slash adventure game featuring an undead skeletal knight on a path towards redemption, an art style reminiscent of Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas, and gameplay that neatly combined action, exploration, and puzzle solving to create a PlayStation experience unlike any other. The culmination of their passion, dedication, and ambition resulted in a deeply engaging experience that fans the world over still remember fondly to this day, more than 20 years later. This is the story of Medieval. Medieval is the brainchild of Chris Sorrell and Jason Wilson. Prior to Medieval, Chris had worked on the James Pond series, where he handled the design, graphics, and programming. Before that, he worked as a graphic artist for Vectordine on a number of titles, including Dogs of War, Bad Company, Fire and Brimstone, and Yolanda, the latter of which was his first commercial coding project. When work on James Pond 3 wrapped up, he joined Millennium Interactive, where he was given the opportunity to work on something new. Jason, meanwhile, happened to be finishing up work on his own projects, and was convinced to help Chris start Medieval in 1995 by Millennium's development director, Ian Saunter. Before this, Jason worked as the lead artist on a number of titles, including Pac-Mania, Thunderbirds the Game, Space Harrier 2, Hero Quest, Thunderstrike, and Diggers, just to name a few. He'd already met Chris before, when he was a freelancer, and they were both big fans of horror movies, zombies, and the like, so it was a great match. The first design proposal for Medieval had the working title Dead Man Dan, and described a game that was a fusion of Capcom's Ghosts and Goblins series with the art style of Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas. While the Tim Burton inspiration was a guiding factor throughout, the Ghosts and Goblins reference was always a looser thing, as Chris never set out to exactly mimic the mechanics or structure of it, more the general spooky vibe and the idea of a game set completely at night with a dark yet still colourful aesthetic. Jason shared Chris's interest in dark gothic-influenced artwork, and they worked together to define the look and feel of the game. This led to the concept of an undead knight as the main character, called Sir Daniel Fortescue. From the beginning, Chris had a very clear idea of many of Dan's most defining visual traits, such as his long gangly limbs, his crazy teeth, his missing eye and jawbone, etc. The aim was to give him a goofy, quirky sort of look, but at the same time, for him to also appear to be the valiant, brave character that he actually is. Jason helped in sketching out the concepts, which was the first task in their collaboration, and they pretty much settled on the look for Dan right away. A further concept sketch by character animator Mitch Phillips refined a few details, such as a slightly flatter skull and some tweaks to the armor. Dan's story, on the other hand, took a while to be fully realized. It was originally a simple tale about a skeletal knight who'd hack and slash his way through hordes of zombie armies with little purpose or meaning. They reached a point where it felt like, for people to really care about Dan, he needed to be more. They brought in a script doctor called Martin Pond and spent some time working with him, both to further develop Dan's character and to write the script. It was Martin who suggested redemption as a core theme, and both Chris and Jason happily went with it. The core Medieval team consisted of around a dozen or so people, and none of them had any real experience making a 3D game of this scale before. This meant that every little step they made felt like a gratifying sense of achievement, as it was all new to them. Jason still remembers marveling at their first animated 3D object that walked across a flat plane, and the time when they got their first textured landscape up and running. These breakthrough moments usually came during the early hours of the morning, after they'd pulled many long nights, and it was moments like these that really brought the team together. Things like camera and character control presented a lot of interesting new challenges, and required the team to try out a number of approaches before they settled on solutions that seemed to work. While working on the game, Super Mario 64 arrived on the scene, and the team was blown away by how well it brought familiar Mario mechanics into 3D. Tomb Raider and Crash Bandicoot also made an impact, but by the time these games released, development of Medieval was already sufficiently underway, so they didn't really change their plans. They did help them to understand how they might solve some of the challenges they were facing in building a 3D action game for the first time though. They tried pushing themselves in their engine as much as they could, with the engine being a constant challenge, as they were often constrained by memory, which affected how large the levels could be. They had a limit of about 7,500 polygons for an entire level. As development progressed, and the size of the game's code inevitably increased, they would find themselves having to call more and more polygons from the levels just to keep everything running. They were a team with big ambitions, and they needed the support of a publisher in order to finance those ambitions. From almost day one, the team was in sell mode, with the future of the studio riding on their ability to attract a major publishing deal as soon as possible. Consequently, the first year of development was as much about creating materials to sell the game as it was building the design. Although they knew they wanted to create a console game, there was no certainty as to which platform it would be on. Part of Jason's job was to analyze the technology of each appropriate platform to see how they could create geometry and level design ideas based on the limitations of the hardware. They worked on multiple platforms, including Windows PC, Sega Saturn, and Sony PlayStation. Both Sega and Microsoft showed initial interest, and for a while they thought they might be signing up with Sega, but about 10 months in, they got the chance to demo the game for Sony. After delivering what Chris describes as their best pitch ever, Sony got behind the project, and within a few weeks they'd signed up to make an exclusive PlayStation game. As work on the game progressed, however, internal rumblings at Millennium Interactive gave the team cause for concern. The part of the Millennium team that had developed CyberLife, an AI technology first used in the game Creatures, was rather more concerned with developing that technology than in creating regular games. They were looking to sell off their traditional games division, and it reached a point where it was looking like they might be sold to a company that many believed would be a really bad partner. Chris took a huge gamble and arranged a secret meeting with their Sony producer to tell them what was happening. He could imagine nothing better than if they could finish development of Medieval as a first-party Sony studio. Fortunately, a few months later, Chris's wish came true, as Sony did indeed purchase the studio, and they were later rebranded as Sony Computer Entertainment Cambridge Studio. Over the course of Medieval's development, the game became less arcadey and a little more of a Zelda-like adventure. Jason, with Chris's blessing, was responsible for pushing the game in this direction, and added a lot of details to the story of the world and its characters, as well as writing the preliminary scripts and working on the voiceover recordings. He also got to work with one of his childhood heroes, Paul Darrow, of BBC Blake 7 fame, who played the role of Zarok. The voice of Dan, meanwhile, was played by Jason himself. He would write a script for what Dan actually says, and then just read the lines through gritted teeth with a bucket over his head. According to Chris, the comedy in Medieval was a happy accident, as they didn't set out to make the game intrinsically funny. Instead, if the opportunity to inject humour into the script presented itself, they simply took it, and Medieval became all the better for it. Many of the game's initial concept drawings were done at a time when Photoshop was in its infancy and Maya didn't even exist. As a result, most of Jason's concept art was drawn on paper using crayons and splashes of paint. Early drawings showed what the game's camera might have originally looked like. At this very early stage, Dan was going to move along a linear path, kind of like Crash Bandicoot, and was very much on rails. It was a very traditional hack-and-slash game, and lacked the more freeform levels that the final game shipped with. They were also going to have levels that had fixed camera angles, looking down and from the side. Chris fought tooth and nail to move away from this rigid camera system in favour of a camera that would allow players to explore a little more and to see things from all angles. As the game progressed, and they became more confident in the technology, they were able to develop a much more freeform camera that, while far from perfect, allowed players to explore the world of Gallowmere in a more immersive manner. Later in development, Sony requested that Medieval should support the then new PlayStation Analog Controller, which turned out to be a particularly fortuitous event, as the team was struggling to capture even a fraction of the fluidity and intuitiveness that Super Mario 64 was so effortlessly offering thanks to the N64 controller. Once their prototype pad arrived, they discovered that it was actually really simple to hook up a camera relative control system, and after a small amount of debate, they decided to make both analog and digital controls camera relative. The game's level designs were created on large pieces of card in biro pen. Jason would use coloured pencils to literally draw the polygons of a piece of environment. He'd colour in each of the polys, which showed how the texture would piece together. This very crude method was known as per-face mapping. These drawings would then be built in a very low polygon form in a 3D software package called Nworld, while the in-game textures were digitally drawn in Photoshop 2.0 with a mouse. Everything was mapped out before the game was programmed, which helped Medieval come together like a well-planned jigsaw. Most of the specific level design came from Jason, although he and Chris worked together on the level themes and mechanics. They were always striving for a rewarding mix of exploration, puzzle solving, combat and platforming. Since Jason didn't have a lot of geometry to throw around, he had to be rather inventive with their use of space. While mapping out the levels in these drawings, he'd make notes showing where all of the puzzles and objects were, where enemies would spawn, etc. The game's environments were based heavily on German expressionism, which is what Tim Burton based a lot of his early stuff on, meaning lots of wonky, weird angles. This gave the game a rather unique look, as a lot of other games at the time appeared very rigid and block-like. Despite their crude technology, Jason was determined to push the levels of distortion and curvature of the in-game environments by designing levels on raised domes, rolling slopes, and forced perspectives. A now out-of-print book called Film Architecture became the backbone of Jason's reference and inspiration for Medieval. It was a fantastic source of set design for mostly German expressionism films from the 1920s, such as De Golem, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which he used as a style guide for Medieval, Metropolis, and Sunrise, amongst others. Some of the environment designs were also influenced by various locations he would see every day in Cambridge. Medieval's soundtrack was composed by Paul Bob Arnold and Andrew Barnabas, or Bob and Barn. It was their first attempt at composing a fully orchestral score using synthesized instrumentation. While they would have liked to have recorded with a full orchestra, the budget simply wasn't there, so the score was produced entirely in samples. They composed the game's music with just one Akai S3200 sampler using the Peter Seidlux Orchestra, Advanced Orchestra, and Classical Choir sample CD-ROMs, and one Roland JV1080 synthesizer. Despite these limitations, they were happy with the way their score turned out. Chris had a clear idea of what Medieval should sound like musically, with him wanting it to have a Danny Elfman feel. He gave them CDs from Danny Elfman, Elliot Goldenthal, and Wojciech Kila to listen to, and they assimilated as much as they could so that they could create a sound palette and overarching theme that would unify everything. Being that a lot of the visual design of the game and characters took ideas from the film The Nightmare Before Christmas and elements of Ghosts and Goblins, they took a lot of their musical ideas from this genre. They also spent time with the team, looking at concept art and discussing what it should sound like. For sound effects, Medieval saw the development of a custom sound API. Since the PlayStation had such tiny amounts of RAM for sound effects, Chris figured out that with clever code, he could manipulate these sounds in real time to make them go a lot further. For example, he turned a tiny ghost appear sound effect into the constantly evolving Hell Fountain sound. An earthworm called Morton, who lived in Dan's empty eye socket, was originally supposed to feature in the game, but didn't quite make the cut. An unused FMV sequence for the level Inside the Asylum shows Dan using Morton to unlock the door. Jason illustrated and mocked up a level that featured Morton, which would have been a playable side-scrolling level. Instead, Morton's only appearance was in the FMV introduction to the Ghost Ship level, which itself was originally supposed to be playable and was intended to be a chase-styled level, but was removed due to it not being very fun gameplay-wise. According to Jason, the Ant Caves level came about one night while talking about his love of the Alien films. They decided to have a bonus level where Dan is shrunk down to the size of an ant in order to free cocoon fairies from an ant's nest in what was essentially a silly version of Aliens. But Jason didn't want boring, normal-looking fairies, so he decided to make them look like mini Bob Hoskins and have them sound like gruff, foul-tempered Cockney gangsters instead. Chris recalls that they already had more work on their plate than they knew what to do with, but they were so enamored with the idea of a tiny Dan running around fighting giant ants that they somehow managed to swap out some other areas to squeeze it in. The Graveyard level probably gave the team the most hassle, as it was the first level they made for the game, so it went through numerous changes over the course of development. The severed zombie hands, featured in that level, were a reference to the film The Evil Dead. Incidentally, the game's title, Medieval, actually came from Evil Dead 3, Army of Darkness, which had the working title Medieval Dead. Medieval was released for the PlayStation on the 1st of October 1998, just in time for Halloween. The game repaid Sony's faith several times over and was a massive success in both Europe and the US. It was especially surprising that Sony Computer Entertainment America was so behind the game, since it was an entirely European project with a very English sense of humour. The game's distinctive plot, combined with Dan's unusual appearance, turned out to be quite appealing, and the game garnered a great word-of-mouth reputation. After the game's release, they discovered that a lot of women played Medieval, and that they found Dan to be very endearing. Jason believed that Dan was an antidote to all the macho video game characters. Chris was particularly pleased with how the game performed, as it was the best possible vindication of the enthusiasm and belief they'd long had in the project. A Japanese version of Medieval was also created, but Dan didn't prove to be the best suited character for that market. In the Japanese version, Dan wears a helmet that isn't present in any other version of the game. The helmet was a stipulation from their Japanese partners, as there were concerns that Dan's skeletal head might be seen as a bad spirit and not a hero, so it was decided to hide Dan's face behind a mask. Shawn Layden was a great ally to their team, helping them to work with Sony partners in Japan to create the Japanese version of Medieval. With the success of the first game, a sequel was inevitable. Chris had a few ideas scribbled down, but ultimately wasn't as involved in the development of Medieval 2 as he would have liked to have been, as he was given the opportunity to come up with a brand new game for the PS2, which became Primal. It was Chris who came up with the idea of setting Medieval 2 in the Victorian era. Since Dan goes back to his grave at the end of the first game, the team knew the sequel would be set in a different time period. As the birthplace of all things Gothic, the Victorian era was the perfect setting and inspiration for the game. Chris's original concept for Medieval 2 didn't have Sir Daniel as the main playable character, but Sir Henry, a more recently deceased descendant of Dan's. He'd done a sketch late one night, while working on the first Medieval, of Sir Henry wearing a tattered Victorian cape, top hat and monocle. The sketch also featured an owl that he had in mind as the game's mentor. A couple of other ideas he recalled, being Jack the Ripper and, as an endgame boss, Queen Victoria, who, due to some crazy magic, had been inflated into a 50-foot-tall lumbering giant zombie under the spell of the game's antagonist. A cut level called Parliament was intended to be the battleground for fighting Queen Victoria, but was changed to a different level when she was dropped for the demon that replaced her. Jason was left to work on Medieval 2 on his own for a while, so he went away and knocked around a few ideas to embellish Chris's overall brief, which was how they worked on the first game as well. At some point in this early design spec, they had Zarek imprisoned in the Tower of London, and the player had to team up with him to save the day. After Jason worked on this design spec, a new project director became involved, James Shepard. Chris passed all of his ideas over to James during a couple of meetings they had at the start of the project. After their first meeting, a couple of things they'd been discussing clicked together, and he went into their second session with a sketch of Dan's head atop one of the severed hands from the first game. This became the basis for Dan Hand, a new form that allowed Dan to explore new areas and solve puzzles. Before settling on this idea though, they originally had an idea where Dan could take out his eyeball and pop it into areas he had no access to, so that he could spy. James ran with Chris's ideas, and naturally introduced many of his own, such as replacing Zarok with Lord Palethorn, as well as the boxing match with Iron Slugger. In terms of art design, Jason decided that if Zarok was thin and fey, then Lord Palethorn would be wide, square and gruff. He liked a lot of James's ideas, and approved of the main character still being Dan, but felt that the boxing match was misplaced, and that the level designs were rather flat compared to the original game. Jason had little to do with the level design on Medieval 2, as most of his time was spent on the art direction and concepts. The only thing Jason designed level-wise was the Coffin Daylight puzzle rooms featured in the Wolfram Hall level. The generally flatter level designs stem from the team wanting to try out a new camera system, which arguably led to a more stable and user-friendly camera. Medieval 2 began development shortly after the first game released, with the design of the game being revealed to the studio during an all-staff meeting around the end of 1998. A lot of their core technology was recoded, so in some ways it was like starting from scratch. Improvements to their engine allowed them to throw around a few more polygons, resulting in bigger levels, better enemy logic, and more moves for Dan. They also had a degree of geometry skinning, which meant they could deform limbs and faces. Jason worked to make Dan a little more rounded, giving him the ability to change facial expressions, so that they could put a little more emotion into him. He also had a number of costume changes too. The team very much wanted to keep the same integrated mix of puzzle solving, exploration, and hack and slash action as the original, but also wanted to improve upon all of those areas as well. For those that enjoyed the combat, they made the fighting better and gave Dan's weapons a complete overhaul. They kept the best weapons from the first game, like the hammer and broadsword, but added more weapon variety in the form of the Gatling gun, pistol, blunderbuss, cane stick, and flaming crossbow, whilst also diversifying the way enemies reacted to them. For those that enjoyed exploring, they created levels up to 3 times as large, thanks to their new modular loading, And for those that enjoyed puzzle solving, they created some real brain teasers with their new Dan Hand feature. Medieval 2 also introduced several new characters to the series, including Professor Hamilton Kift, who builds new, stronger weapons to help Dan on his quest, Winston Chapelmount, a ghost who offers Dan cryptic advice, and generally serves a similar function to the gargoyles in the first game, and Princess Kia, a rejuvenated Egyptian princess and love interest for Dan. She was originally called Dawn, in reference to the film Dawn of the Dead. Bob and Barn returned to do the music for Medieval 2, and were given a brief that simply asked for more of the same, since the soundtrack of the first game had been so successful. This, they decided, wasn't enough. As with the design of the game, they wanted to do more, but there was a limit to how far they could go using synthesizers and samples. Once again, a live orchestra was simply out of the question, for cost reasons, so in order to achieve a more realistic sound, they needed a more extensive use of samples and a more authentic film approach to composition. They bolstered their audio setup with a bunch of new sample CDs, as well as a Kurzweil K2500R synthesizer. Once everything was in place, they proceeded to create a virtual orchestra in the studio, using all of the available outputs on each device to help them when mixing the final compositions, as well as giving them the freedom to pan the sampled instruments as they would appear on stage in a standard orchestra. Through trial and error, they'd already learned a substantial amount about orchestration, but they wanted to take it to the next level. Fortunately, one of Bob's friends, Michael Price, happened to be the musical assistant of Hollywood film composer Michael Kamen and offered his services for free. He came to Cambridge to provide an insight into writing for a real orchestra and taught them how to treat samples as they would the real thing. Even with this new approach, samples can only be so realistic, so to try to make up for this, they implemented some MIDI controls on their main instruments. This allowed them to manipulate them in real time in order to approximate some of the subtleties of live playing. Medieval 2 was released for the PlayStation in time for Easter on the 19th of April 2000, and went on to win the BAFTA award for Best Console Game for that year. Although Chris wasn't as involved as he would have liked to have been, he was nonetheless pleased with what the team had accomplished. Though he would have kept the Hall of Heroes, since he always believed that was one of the more distinctive presentational mechanics they'd created in the first game. He also disliked Dan's new voice, the squeaky-voiced Winston, and thought the game's humour was a little too puerile in some places for his liking. While Medieval 2 sold well, it wasn't the type of game that screamed, "must make a sequel," to management. As such, Medieval never received a new game for the PS2, at least not officially. After work on Primal wrapped up in early 2003, Chris was eager to make a new Medieval game. Along with a few others, he explored a concept that he thought would be a lot of fun. According to Unseen64, Medieval 3 Fate's Arrow, as it would have been called, picked up Dan's story after the end of Medieval 2, with Dan travelling back in time 100 years before the events of the first game, and just a few weeks before the Battle of Gallowmere is due to occur. While Dan was originally shot in the eye by the first arrow, thus freeing his men to fight on to victory, unburdened by his leadership, he learns that the timeline has somehow changed. Princess Kia reveals herself as the Egyptian sorceress, Kiont, and has tricked Dan into rescuing her, stealing the time machine, and delivering her into the hands of Zarok, for which she aligns herself with. By using the fabled Anubis stone, she aids Zarok by raising an army of undead, and plans to make sure that the living Dan doesn't die quite so soon, instead sticking around long enough to truly doom his brave compatriots. If that happens, Zarok and Kiont would achieve a crushing victory, the Earth would be overrun with demons, and humanity enslaved. In order to stop the timeline from being altered, Dan would have been tasked with retrieving the Anubis stone, and ensuring that his cowardly living self dies by the first arrow, allowing Zarok to be defeated, and history to play out as it should. This would have also been a chance to reflect on Dan's real story, and in doing so, to appreciate the true hero he had become in death, compared to the miserable individual he was in life, with a few nods to the first season of the British comedy series, Blackadder. Medieval 3 would have borrowed a few ideas from Primal, featuring a companion sidekick called Lupo, who'd be a key figure to the game. Lupo is Dan's underappreciated, but utterly faithful hound, who first meets Skeletal Dan at the beginning of the game, and then joins him on his journey. Players would then be able to direct Lupo's attacks by throwing a squeaky dog toy. Essentially, he would follow Dan around as an AI character, whilst doing typically sidekick-like things. The game would have also featured a more open hub-based structure to the world, with a story driving things forward. Dan and Lupo would travel to both old and new locations of Gallowmere in their attempt to find allies to aid them against Zarok and Kiant, with one of those allies being an eccentric genie named Al-Zalam. Chris also planned to bring back the Hall of Heroes after it was left absent in Medieval 2. Medieval 3 would have also featured new weapons, puzzles and power-ups. One new addition would be beast riding, where Dan gets a mount in the form of a dragon elephant that was seen in the underwater portion of the lake level from the first game. Medieval 3 would have expanded the Medieval universe in a whole new way, and would have featured a satisfying conclusion to Dan's heroic journey. Unfortunately, this never came to be. At the time this concept was pitched, a couple of things were happening at Sony Cambridge. The first was that the popular 24 TV series license had become available to the studio, and the second was that the PSP had become a significant company focus. It's worth noting that Medieval 3 was never anything more than a design proposal with a handful of artworks to show some of the new features and characters. By this point, their studio management had changed, and an entirely new team took on responsibility of bringing Medieval to the PSP in the form of a remake of the first game titled Resurrection. Although Chris stressed how much he would have loved to work on bringing Medieval up to date, management wanted him to work on 24 the game instead. Chris and Jason were both offered advice and consultation roles, but it was done so at arm's length and without any sense of ownership that it didn't sit well with Chris. Although he was able to accept some of the changes the new team made, he felt that he and his team's Medieval vision was what made the series, and was really sorry to see certain characters needlessly redesigned. Jason was a little more involved in the remake, as he revisited his role as the voice of Dan, unlike Medieval 2, but he was also disheartened with having to watch something he dearly loved get needlessly tinkered with. It was made clear to them that the new team needed space to make their own game, and with the failings of Primal so fresh, Chris was in no place to argue. The new team went on to make a game that was technically superior to the original, and made some noticeable character design improvements, but also spoiled a number of other characters, altered the story, weakened several levels, and omitted some of the best Medieval levels altogether. Medieval Resurrection started life as a PS2 game, and was supposedly more playable on the PS2 thanks to the precision of a dedicated controller. The game was later ported to the PSP at the behest of Sony's senior management, who wanted a PSP launch game and decided that a Medieval remake, or remix, was the way to go. Dominic Kalin was the game's lead designer, and was tasked with creating this new version of Medieval. He worked closely with Pierce Jackson, the game's producer, to scope out the project. As a designer, with his own creative vision, Dominic naturally wanted to make the game as different from the original as possible, whilst also generally improving the game where appropriate. Aside from Chris and Jason providing advice and consultation roles, the only person who returned from the original Medieval team was Mitch Phillips, who worked as the project's lead artist, having previously handled the character animation for Medieval and Medieval 2. Many of the original team still worked in the studio though, and they were always available for hints, tips and general advice. The team recreated everything from scratch, meaning all of the code, graphics and voices were different, with only the basic story and some of the locations from the first game remaining intact. They wanted to showcase the full capabilities of the PSP, including its Wi-Fi functionality, so they added mini-games, multiplayer, and even a PSP-friendly Save Anywhere feature. The ideas that they thought worked well in the original were preserved, although in many cases, their use was altered to keep it feeling fresh. Some of the new elements they introduced included new combat maneuvers, new levels, characters, and bosses. There were also significant additions to the plot, in the form of the Anubis Stone, which strengthened the story arc, and the creation of Al-Zalam to act as Dan's internal monologue and the player's guide. Both of these ideas came from the earlier Medieval 3 pitch that failed to get off the ground. Development of Medieval Resurrection proved to be quite challenging, as not only was the team working on an entirely new platform, but they had no code or engine, and for a long time, they didn't even have development kits. Outside of logistical difficulties, the biggest differences was in the gameplay challenges of a portable console. They were used to developing games for the PS2 and original PlayStation, but now they had to consider what a player would want from a PSP game, such as the aforementioned Save Anywhere feature, as well as shorter, more intense levels. It changed the whole way they went about developing the game. The plot was structured into more milestones than a conventional game to allow for shorter play sessions without losing the storyline or direction. Bob and Barn returned once again to compose the game's music. It was the culmination of 7 years of work for them, revisiting old themes from Medieval, as well as having the chance to rewrite new material. This time, they were given the budget to record the score with a live orchestra and choir, and as such, they were able to compose the music the way they had intended the original game's music to sound. 2 additional levels were planned for Medieval Resurrection, but were cut from the final game due to time constraints. These were the Crystal Caves and the Asylum Grounds, featuring the riddles of Jack of the Green. Both were based loosely on levels from the original game. The sunken town Mellowmead, featured in the lake level from the first game, is referenced in Medieval Resurrection during the cutscene with Death in the Return to the Graveyard level. However, it was just mentioned for fun, and to stay true to the idea that Gallowmere was a real place with consistent history and geography, as opposed to there actually being plans to remake this level. Over the years, a number of ideas have been thrown around for possible Medieval sequels, none of which found much traction, as the studio was usually focusing its efforts on other games. According to Jason, they once dabbled with some ideas for a PS3 game utilising the PlayStation Move controllers, but they ended up moving away from this in order to try out something completely new, which became TV Superstars. While nothing officially went ahead, they did do some artwork and design that would have taken place back in old Gallowmere and would have seen Jack Frost, hungry for power, plunging the land into everlasting winter. He builds a frozen undead army of ice demons, trolls, and creatures made from snow and ice that take their energy from the cold. Unlike living creatures, Dan, being dead already, would not feel the effects of the bitter life-sapping cold, so he was the perfect hero to fight the Ice Lord. The game was going to be a loose parody of the book series A Game of Thrones, with the game even having the working title A Game of Bones. They had some neat ideas for using snow and ice versus warmth and heat, and there would have been some cool environmental features as the land freezes or thaws during combat, with enemies getting weaker the warmer Gallowmere becomes, and vice versa. The story would have taken place 100 years after the first game, with Dan being mostly forgotten and seen as an out-of-date fairy tale. A small group of Fortescue cultists carry the flame of Dan's legend, and when the time comes, they resurrect Dan to help save the day. But things are not that simple, as the kingdom is rooting for its own popular hero, a handsome macho heroic knight, who has vowed to save the day, and he isn't going to let Dan get in the way of his glory. Their relationship would have been a bit like Woody and Buzz's in Toy Story, and at some point, the two would have to pair up and put their differences aside in order to defeat Jack Frost. While they did some game design and storyboards, the project was never officially given the go-ahead, so in a sense, it never really existed, apart from throwing some ideas around. In 2017, a teaser trailer for a PS4 remake of Medieval premiered at Sony's PlayStation Experience event. There was initially some confusion as to whether or not this game was a full remake or just a remaster. Sean Layden later clarified on the 25th of October 2018 in a PlayStation blogcast that this was in fact a full remake, and that Sony was bringing back some of the folks who worked on the original game to assist with its development. Shortly thereafter, on the 1st of November 2018, Jason confirmed on Twitter that he and Chris were involved with the consultation work on the Medieval remake, from art to design. While he couldn't say too much about his involvement, he did mention that the remake was back to the ethos of the original game, and how both he and Chris wanted to avoid the vibe and tone of the PSP version. He also confirmed that he was reprising his role as the voice of Dan, Bucket included. A new Medieval trailer dropped on Halloween, showcasing some actual gameplay, as well as some comparisons to the first game. The Medieval remake was developed by Other Ocean Interactive in partnership with Sony's International Software Development Team for release on the 25th of October 2019. Sony provided the team with design details and assets from the original game in order to bring Medieval back to life on modern tech. They overhauled the horror-themed visuals while still retaining its Tim Burton-esque personality. They rightly refused to tinker with the original level design, but also weren't afraid to add the occasional flourish where appropriate. The camera system was also greatly improved over the original, and they also added a new over-the-shoulder camera, dubbed DanCam, that players can switch to by holding the L2 button. One of the key pillars of the game's design was to be extremely authentic to the original PlayStation game, with Nick Accordino, the game's producer, commenting in a PlayStation Underground video that if you had the PS1 strategy guide for Medieval, you'd be able to use it to beat the Medieval remake. Whenever the development team thought about altering or changing something, they'd later discover that there was a very specific reason why they couldn't do that. They'd go into the code, see a strange design decision, and then go on a journey to try to solve challenges further in the game, only to ultimately realise why the original team did things the way they did. One of the challenges of making the Medieval remake was that they didn't want to deliver an exact replica of the first game. Instead, they wanted to deliver the game that people remembered playing and what they took away from it. The team had access to the original source code and could see that the original team intended to take the game further, such as boss battles that had states that they were working on but were commented out, so they were able to see what their artistic design was and what they were trying to achieve. It was almost like an archaeological project, where they were digging up all of this material, talking with the original team, trying to find out exactly what they were thinking and feeling back then. They used this as a way to springboard to the new direction they wanted to take the game, the presentation, and the feel and the mechanics. Enemies in particular were a huge challenge, because the original game featured 56 distinct enemy types, which is something practically unheard of by today's standards. New bestiary entries were also freshly written for the remake by Chris Sorrell himself. At Gamescom 2019, a playable demo of the Medieval remake was made available, which not only confirmed that Jason Wilson was reprising his role as Dan, but that elsewhere, all of the voice acting was exactly the same CD quality audio from the PS1 title, with one new addition to the cast being the game's new narrator, portrayed by Lani Minella. This was also confirmed in a PlayStation Underground video, where they played through the Asylum Grounds level and could confirm that Jack of the Green was the same voice actor, played by Paul Darrow. Additionally, the game's classic score also hadn't been tampered with, instead it was enriched. The original game's orchestral synthesized sound was replaced with the real thing, with the score being re-recorded by the Prague Symphony Orchestra and overseen by original composers Bob and Barn. As for whether or not a third Medieval game will actually be made someday, well, that remains to be seen. If you enjoyed this look back at the Medieval franchise, and would like to see more documentaries like this in the future, then please let me know by liking this video and subscribing to my channel. If you want to see all of my sources and research notes for this video, then feel free to follow the link in the description below to a public Patreon post where I've listed them. And while you're there, if you're able to throw $1 or $2 my way, that'd be most appreciated.